Y'all hear me? Test. All right. Well, I think it's right at 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I guess we got a little bit of a light crowd tonight since I guess the hurricane is blown in and it's treacherous out there. So um, anyway, I appreciate all y'all being here. We're moving on along. In fact, I think that after tonight, I think it'll be just three more, maybe two, but probably three more lessons, and we'll be done. So let's have a prayer before we get started. Father, we just thank you so much for allowing us to be here tonight, and thank you for this church and for each person that's here at Forsyth. And we just pray that you'll help us to be the kind of church that you want us to be, that we'll be a church that's on fire for you, that we'll love you and Jesus the way that we should, that we'll love other people, that we'll be mission-minded, and that we'll teach truth. And I just thank you for Jesus and for the love he had for each of us. And I just want to thank you for you, God, and for that you're, and acknowledge that you're the only God, that you're on your throne, that you're ruling, that you're in control of all things. And no matter what happens on this earth, we know that you're in control and that we have a home in heaven awaiting us one day. And I just pray that you'll be with us tonight as we continue our study of this great book. And thank you for the blessing that we've had because of it. And we just pray that you'll be with us tonight. Be with me as I teach. Just pray that you'll give me wisdom and that the words I say will be in accordance with your will. In Christ's name we pray, amen. All right, so we're going to be start off in chapter 17 tonight. And I think I've been, or at least trying to get the point across throughout this study that, Revelation was written to a group of people that was in a particularly hard season, a hard time in their life, because they were living under the thumb of an evil empire that demanded their worship. And really it was worship, obviously, that they could only, as Christians, legitimately give to Jesus. And so because of that, they were in a pretty tough spot, because this Rome and the emperor were demanding their worship. And we've seen that the pressure that they were under was coming basically from three different sources. And the first source, or that demanded their allegiance, was Rome and the empire. And then we found out that behind Rome there were these other powers, right? The beast that we talked about, which represented the emperor, and then also the cult of emperor worship that we learned about later was also called in Revelation the false prophet. And how both of those people were actually working for the dragon, who is Satan. And so when we get here in chapter 17 and 18, we're going to see how God deals with Babylon. And then when we get to chapter 18, we're going to see how God deals with the beast. And then finally in chapter 19, how he deals with the dragon. And we saw last week when we looked at the 7 bowls of wrath, we saw a picture of God's divine judgment against Rome. We talked about how God's wrath was holy and perfect. And so what's going to happen now is going to be, I think I mentioned this kind of at the end of the lesson last week, is that concept of recapitulation, which is just retelling a story again. Remember I gave you the analogy of an instant replay, how you see a play from one view and then you get a different angle, maybe several different angles. And so the 7 bowls that we looked at last week were basically just a wide-angle view of God's wrath or judgment against Rome. And so now, when we get to chapter 17, we're going to kind of zoom in on the details of what that judgment against Rome looks like, and also against those that depend on Rome as well. And so God uses this different angle to tell the story of his judgment. And he's going to start with Babylon. And so you'd think that most of his attention would be given to the beast or to the dragon. But again, like I mentioned, he's going to start with Babylon. Rick actually says this. He said the reason why that is because that's what the church felt the most every day. That was what was real to them and what they could see with their own eyes, talking about the Roman Empire. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to read chapter 17, and I'm just going to read the entire chapter, and then we'll talk about what's in there. So starting in chapter 17, verse 1, it says, One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters. With her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries." And then the angel carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names, and had 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was dressed in purple and scarlet, and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries. And the name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus. And when I saw her, I was greatly astonished. And then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I will explain to you the mystery of the woman and the beast she rides, which has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king, and he belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. And then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." All right. Pretty fascinating language, I think. And really, this 17, 18, 19, and 20, 21, it's just over and over. There's this language that I mean, how could anybody think of writing this? I mean, I think it's just amazing. So we see here in verse 1 that one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls invites John to come with him for a closer inspection of the fate that's about to be inflicted on Babylon, which is, I think I've told you before, is also synonymous with Rome. And so the metaphor that Jesus uses for Babylon here is what? A prostitute, right? So, and I think this is important because it really stands in contrast to language we've heard about Christ, right? Remember, Christ is referred to as the pure bride, or the church is referred to as the pure bride of Christ, is what I meant to say. I like what Rick actually said about sin here. He said we tend to think about sin like as a location, like here's God over here, and then there's sin over here, and sin has separated us from God. And there's this big gulf between us, between sin and God. But the Bible tends to talk about sin not in terms of a location, but in terms of a relationship. That sin at its heart is a betrayal. And the most common word used for this is adultery. And this is nothing new, because this type of language has been used repeatedly in the Old Testament to describe Israel's relationship with God. In the Old Testament, that relationship was compared to a marriage where God was the husband and Israel was the bride. And so by worshiping other gods, which we've read about all throughout the Old Testament, the people violated their marriage covenant with God, and they assumed the role of a prostitute who embraces many lovers. And there's all kinds of scriptures that refer to this. I can't remember if I put this in your handout or not, but just a few of those are Hosea chapter 2, verse 5. Is that in there? Did I put that in there? So Hosea 2:5, Jeremiah 2:20, Jeremiah 3:1 through 14, and Ezekiel 16:36. Now we don't have time to go through all those, but those are all all that marriage type language about how Israel has violated their covenant with God. And so I want you to notice that all throughout this chapter and in chapter 18, this adjectives about this prostitute, the opulence and the affluence of this woman. And so this woman who parades herself around like a queen, Jesus just calls a prostitute, right? Or a common whore is what he refers to her as. So pretty strong language. And there's no mistake as to the identity of, in this context of Revelation. In fact, first of all, we see in verse 5 that she is Babylon. And then we see, secondly, in verse 6, that she's drunk with the blood of God's holy people and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And then finally, in verse 18, we see that she's the great city that rules the kings of the earth. And so all these descriptions just let us know who this woman is, and that's because this woman is Rome, the city where the beast is worshipped and from where the orders have gone out to persecute the saints or the church of God. And so again, Jesus calls Rome a prostitute. And so why did Jesus use this picture of Rome here in chapter 17? Well, the metaphor of the prostitute implies that Rome's offering something that men lust over or that they want. Verse 2 says that the kings of the earth had committed adultery with her, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. So how is that? How were they intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries? Well, they did this through their economic, their military, their cultural, and especially their religious alliances with Rome. So basically, Rome has seduced the entire world with the offer of wealth. And we're going to see specifically about this in chapter 18. We're going to see examples of Rome's wealth and how she had seduced people. Verse 1 says that she sits on many waters, which we actually are in verse 15 read what that means. It says that this is identified as peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. We see that again in verse 15. And this seems to be a reference really to just the worldwide dominion and influence that Rome had throughout. And then verse 3, John says that the woman is sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. And again, this beast is not anything new. This is the same beast from the sea that we read about, the same description even of the beast that we read about and saw in chapter 13. Again, it's Rome personified as its emperors was what the beast from the sea was. And so the picture of the woman sitting on the beast reminds us that the city of Rome owed its position to the emperors as heads of the powerful Roman state. And so the great prostitute was described by John with these words in verses 4 through 6. It says, "The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. And she held a golden cup in her hand filled with the abominable things and the filth of her adulteries." So her dress and her jewelry here just are pictures of, are indications of her wealth and her splendor. Rubel Shelley says this about the golden cup. He said, "The golden cup from which she drank was seen as an abomination by John. It contained the intoxicating history of her persecutions of the church." And we see in verse 5 that her name is written on her forehead. What's it say? It says, "Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes." And interestingly enough, during this period of time, it was actually characteristics of prostitutes to actually have their names tattooed on their forehead. And so here, this would be nothing new to a prostitute to have their name written on their forehead. And so there's, again, no mistake that she is Babylon or Rome, the city of seduction, lust, vice, worldliness, and idolatry during this time. Hey, well, we talked about this, I think it was in chapter 14 maybe, whatever, again, because of course you weren't here, you'd know that. But again, because Babylon was associated with being just an evil city. I mean, and really and specifically from Babylon from the Old Testament, a city of wealth, splendor, but that and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second too, that made their power on the backs of other people, and slavery, all kinds of things like that. So that's exactly, and again, Babylon, I talked about this too, in apocalyptic literature during this time, it was very common for people to use the word Babylon to refer to Rome, not just this apocalyptic book, but others during that time as well. So we see beginning in verse 7 that the angel who carried John to see this vision of the prostitute pauses to explain the mystery of the woman and the beast that she rides. And so we see here that the beast once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. So just a little riddle here that John gives us. And I think this points us back to another riddle from chapter 13, verse 3, that says, one of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but that fatal wound had been healed. And if you remember, we talked about that was a reference to Nero, who killed himself in AD 68. And remember, he had persecuted the Christians, but there was this belief that he was going to rise again and come back. And so here, this little riddle here, the beast who once was would point to the past persecutions of Nero. And Nero now is not, right? He's not powerful any longer because he died and the harm that he was doing to the church had stopped. But the beast is about to come back out of the abyss again, and this time with more power, and really make one last stand against God's work in the world. And I believe that refers to Domitian. However, his fate is sealed, we see here, and he's destined to go to destruction. We read that in verse 8. And so a lot of commentaries see this phrase about the beast having been, not now being, and coming again as kind of a parody on the eternal nature of God in Christ. You remember back in chapter 1, verse 4, and also again in 4:8, it was said of God that, well, actually 4 verse 8 said, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come." So this is kind of in a satirical type way here. John points out that the inhabitants of the earth are astonished that the beast who once was, now is not, and yet will come, is not eternal, right? Because it says, in contrast to God and Christ, who are eternal, this beast is going to go to his destruction. So it's just kind of a parody on God's eternal nature versus the beast who's going to be destroyed. So then we see in verse 9 that the 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. And so everyone knew that Rome was built on 7 hills. In fact, there's also a bit of satire here. So there's a very common picture in Rome during that day which pictured the goddess Roma, who was basically a personification of Roman power. And so there's this picture that, and actually this is a coin here of her, and you can see here she's sitting on these hills. So they had this picture of the goddess Roma sitting on these 7 hills, and she's got her foot. It's actually in the, I guess you can't see it so well on the coin, but it's like on the river Tibet, I think it was called, and then she's got her other hand on a sword. And so, and again, just a little bit of satire here. This coin or this image is replaced here with a prostitute now sitting on 7 hills, and instead of a sword in her hand, she holds this golden cup that's filled with vile obscenities. So the 7 heads are 7 hills, but we also see here in verse 10 and 11 that the 7 heads are also 7 kings. And we get this new riddle here that says, 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, but when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. So the kings here mostly refer to the emperors of Rome or the rulers of Rome. And so many people, as you can imagine, have tried to figure out who these kings were, the five that had fallen and so on. And to do this, they go back to Daniel chapter 7, and I'm going to show you a slide here in just a second. But it's very difficult to try to figure out who these emperors were. And the biggest problem is, where do you start? Because this word king here, it doesn't say emperor, it doesn't say Caesar, it says king. So do you start with the first Caesar, who was Julius Caesar, or do you start with the first emperor, which was Caesar Augustus? And so a lot of people have tried, and it's really fascinating. I don't have time to go into all of it, but Jim McGuigan wrote a book, and it's really, really good on Revelation. And so he goes back and looks at the book of Daniel, chapter 7, and figures out, what empires he thinks Daniel was talking about when he talked about the fourth beast, which represented Rome, and how three had fallen, or three were uprooted. Three were uprooted by one of the other kings, and then how in Revelation there are these five that have fallen. So he starts with Augustus, he goes through those five, he leaves out these three. These are the three that were uprooted in Daniel. The reason he leaves them out is because Nero, Galbo, and Otho, their entire reign spanned about 2 years. One of them only ruled for like 2 months, so they weren't really important. So he says that the reason why John left them out was because of that fact. They weren't important. So he can calculate all this and get right down to Domitian. And I believe this as well, that Domitian is this 8th king that belongs to the 7th. And so I give there's like a little recording I make of this lesson beforehand where you can go back and listen to it, and I kind of go in a little bit more detail on it. So it may or may not be true, but there are so many different people who have tried to figure this out, and it's just I think it's impossible. In fact, I believe this. Again, we've talked about how Revelation, the number 7 is used symbolically over and over again. And so I believe that since the number 7 has been used symbolically, that's very likely that the number 7 here, it should be used symbolically as well. And because of this, that the 7 kings here just represent the totality of the beast's power, which is personified in the emperors. And so the statement here about the 8th king who returns as one of the 7th, I think just plays on this Nero Redivus myth that we've talked about before, that Nero was coming back. He's going to rise again. He's going to torment the Christians, and not even the Christians, even the people in Rome didn't like him and were scared of him. And so again, when Domitian came, he was compared to Nero, and so he would thus be the 8th. I like how G.B. Caird sums it up. This is in his commentary. He says this about this sort of discussion of trying to figure out these kings. He said, by attempting to fix a historical timeline in this riddle, and I didn't mention that, but a lot of people try to figure out the names of kings and then figure out this timeline of when Revelation was written. And so he said, to fix a historical timeline in this riddle, we are looking in the wrong direction, and we should see in the 7 kings a symbolic number in keeping with John's penchant for the number 7. He observes that the 7 kings are representative of the whole series of emperors, and they would remain 7 no matter how long the actual list happened to be. So I think the main point that John's trying to emphasize here is that the imperial line of emperors has only a short time to go before there's the emergence of this new monstrous 8th emperor who's going to be one of the 7th. And again, I believe that's Domitian. Questions about that? I could talk for an hour about all the different theories about it, but anyway, I think the symbolic 7 to me makes more sense. All right, so and then verse 12 we see that the 10 horns on the beast are on the beast's 7 heads represent 10 kings who have received no kingdom yet, but they receive authority as kings along with the beast for 1 hour. So that gets really confusing too, because you got kings on the heads, and then you got these other 10 kings, and so on the horns. And so these, I believe, represent Rome's vassal or client kings. I think I've mentioned this before. They're conquered kings and rulers of countries that were allies with Rome. And they all depended on Rome's favor for their right to retain power. And they were given limited power by the beast for only a short time. We see here, what's that time period? 1 hour, which is just a representative number of a short time. And so the point is this, that Rome has her emperors, she has all her rulers, like Herod, who was a vassal king of Rome, who are clients of Rome, and they all go to bed together, and they act like they love each other, right? And they're going to get together, and they're going to, what verse 14 says, they're going to try to wage war against the Lamb. But verse 14 also tells us that it's not going to end very well, because it says the Lamb will triumph over them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And then look at 15 through 18. It says, we see here that the fate of Rome is at the hand of her former, is going to be at the hand of her former allies, and it's predicted in these verses. And basically, there's going to be a falling out among thieves against these people. And so here's how God says it's going to happen in history. He says he's going to use the very people that the prostitute went to bed with to bring the prostitute down. Evil always implodes on itself. Relationships that are built on manipulation eventually die from the very cancer that they're spreading. And we saw this back in Jeremiah. In fact, Jeremiah talks to the people of Judah in Jeremiah 4:30. And these people, in the Old Testament, Judah was making alliances with all these evil empires. And Jeremiah said this to him. He said, what are you doing, you devastated one? Why dress yourself in scarlet and put on jewels of gold? Why highlight your eyes with makeup? You adorn yourself in vain. Your lovers despise you. They want to kill you. So despite Judah's alliances with all these evil nations and their attempts to make themselves look pretty for all these other countries, Jeremiah is just saying, look, you can do all you want, but these allies you're making, they're going to destroy you. And what happened to Judah, right? Babylon destroyed the temple. They took them off as slaves, so it didn't end well for them. And in John's day, it was inconceivable that Rome could fall. So if you're a Christian trying to support your family and you're under the power of Rome, it looks like there is no way that Rome can be defeated. And Babylon never sees it coming. Rome never sees it coming. And really, you can say it about every world power or empire, because every age has a superpower, and they all think that they're going to last forever, and none of them have, and none of them will, because there's only one kingdom that's eternal, right? And that's God's kingdom. So we see here that Rome's judgment is set. It's going to occur because of inner anarchy, rebellion, treachery, and at the hands of these other nations that they've made alliances with. So God assembled all these powers together. In verse 16 it says, to strip Babylon naked and eat her flesh and burn her with fire. So Rome's client and vassal kings were basically just fulfilling the will of God. Daniel 2:21 speaks to this. He says, talking about God, it says, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. All right. Any questions about chapter 17 before we move on to 18? All right. I'm going to do the same thing with 18. I'm going to read all of it, and then we'll talk about it. It says, after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. And with a mighty voice he shouted, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling for demons and a haunt for every impure spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable animal. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, for her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she's done. Pour her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torment and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. For in her heart she boasts, I sit enthroned as queen. I am not a widow. I will never mourn. Therefore in one day her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. And when the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her. Terrified at her torment, they will stand far off and cry, Woe, woe to you, great city, you mighty city of Babylon. In 1 hour your doom has come. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Cargoes of gold, silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple silk and scarlet cloth, every sort of citron wood and articles of every kind made of ivory, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cargoes of cinnamon and spice, of incense, myrrh, and frankincense, of wine and olive oil, of fine flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and carriages, and human beings sold as slaves. And they will say, The fruit you long for is gone from you. All your luxuries and splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. The merchants who sold these things and gained their wealth from her will stand far off, terrified at her torment. They will weep and mourn and cry out, Woe, woe to you, great city, dressed in fine linen, purple and scarlet, and glittering with gold, precious stones and pearls. In 1 hour such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain and all who travel by ship, the sailors and all who earn their living from the sea will stand far off. And when they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, Was there ever a city like this great city? They will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, Woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through your wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin. Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets, for God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you. And then a mighty angel picked up a boulder the size of a large millstone, and he threw it into the sea and said, With such great violence the city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. The music of harpists and musicians, pipers and trumpeters will never be heard in you again. No worker of any trade will ever be found in you again. The sound of a millstone will never be heard in you again. The light of a lamp will never shine in you again. The voice of bridegroom and bride will never be heard in you again. Your merchants were the world's important people. By your magic spell, all the nations were led astray. In her was found the blood of prophets and of God's holy people and of all who have been slaughtered on the earth. All right. All right, let me take a drink of water before I go on. All right, so we see here in verse 1 this phrase that we've actually seen, but we've read before earlier in Revelation. It says, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. And this is also a reference back to Isaiah chapter 21, verse 9. And I think we talked about this before when we mentioned this phrase, but at the time that John was seeing these things happen, and when he was writing Revelation, Babylon had not yet fallen. Yet the overthrow of Babylon was so certain that the angel speaks of it here as if it was already accomplished. He looked into the future and saw the destruction of Rome as already finished. And we mentioned that back in Isaiah when he made that same statement about Babylon, the Babylon in the Old Testament had not been destroyed yet. But again, he knew what God was going to do, that the plans were certain. And so we see this eerie desolation that's replaced this once vibrant city of Rome. And her smoldering ruins have become a dwelling place for demons and buzzards and vultures. And the reason given here for Babylon's fall are that all the nations and kings of the earth have committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxuries. And in verse 4, we see that there's a warning sounded for the people of God to separate themselves completely from Babylon. What's it say in verse 4? It says, "Come out of her, my people, that you will not share in her sins." And in my opinion, this may be the most important, or maybe it's a strong word, one of the most important verses in all of Revelation. And it's because God here is calling these people, and I think he's calling us as well, to make a choice. It speaks to people who have been lulled into complacency by their prosperity, or to those who have decided that compromising their faith by accommodating with Rome was a reasonable price to pay for the favors that were offered them by Babylon. But what Jesus is saying here to these people and to us as well is that you need to get out of Dodge, right? Because Dodge is going down. Leaving Babylon would be choosing the eternal over the external, the real over the fake, the good life over a fleeting thrill. And when Jesus says to come out of Babylon, he's not talking about a physical relocation here. He's talking about a spiritual relocation because, right, there's no way to get away from Babylon. Babylon is everywhere. In fact, if you look at this group of people that are the recipients of this book, they're not even in Rome, right? They're in Asia Minor. And so he's not talking about leaving a city. He's talking about spiritually getting away from what's been going on. In verse 6 and 7, it says, the heavenly voice says that God is going to deal with Babylon in the same way that she's dealt with other people, right? He's going to pay her back double for what she's done. And so when we look at verse 9 through 20, it says, although the fall of Rome would have generated praise from Christians, these verses here picture not praise, but it pictures the kings of the earth, the merchants of the earth, and those who were in the shipping industry. What's it say? It says they're all weeping and mourning over her. And so why is that? Why are they weeping and mourning? Why would they be sad? Well, they're not weeping and mourning because they love Rome. Look at verse 11. It says the merchants of the earth mourn because now, what? No one buys their cargoes anymore. Notice what their cargoes were here. They were gold, silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet cloth, etc. All what I would call luxury items, right? They're not really any staples that are listed here. And look at verse 13. It says, human beings being sold as slaves. So how do empires get rich? Well, one of the main ways that we've seen throughout history is slavery, whether it's real or economic slavery. And so they're not mourning the presence of suffering when Babylon falls. They're mourning the absence of a system that's made them rich at the expense of others. Rick Ashley says this, says, Rome is judged just like Egypt and all the other empires because she became powerful on the backs of the poor and marginalized who had to make their bricks and build the empire. And so what he calls the spirit of Babylon is that of materialism, aimed at gaining wealth at the expense of someone else. This is how all Babylons operate throughout history, and God detests it. And he always judged it. And I found something kind of cool here that I never really knew. You know, when you think about Sodom and Gomorrah and how God judged them, what do you think about? It's always immorality, right? I mean, the just wicked things that they were doing, you know, sexually for the most part. But listen what the prophet Ezekiel said about Babylon in 1649. I mean, not Babylon, but about Sodom and Gomorrah. He said, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. All over the New Testament, the sin that's mentioned more than any other sin is the sin of greed. In fact, twice in the New Testament, greed is called idolatry. We see that in Colossians 3:5 and also Ephesians 5:5. And again, to quote Rick Atchley, it says, "We think as Christians the most horrible thing that could happen to a church is persecution. Actually, the most dangerous thing that could happen to the church is too much accumulation. It destroys empires nationally, and it destroys people personally." So we see here this third group of mourners in verse 19 are the ship captains and the sailors. And it says here, they're pretty distraught, right? It says they throw dust on their head and cry out, "Woe, woe to you, great city, where all who had ships on the sea became rich through their wealth. In 1 hour, she has been brought to ruin." And so really, this is basically just self-pity on their part, right? They're losing the city means that they've just lost this lucrative business partner. And they're not weeping for Rome, they're weeping for their bank accounts. So, but we see in verse 20 that the reaction of the righteous people to the fall of Rome is much different. It says in verse 20, "Rejoice over her, you heavens. Rejoice, you people of God. Rejoice, apostles and prophets, for God has judged her with the judgment she imposed on you." You know, I don't think God takes any pleasure in destruction of the wicked, and nor should we. In fact, in Ezekiel 33:11, it says, "Say to them, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I take no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but rather that they turn from their ways and live. Turn from your evil ways." So, but although God takes no pleasure in it, he still has to do something about it, right? So those who deliberately turn away from God and reject him have to pay a price. And that's what we talked about the wrath of God, about how it's holy because he has to judge evil. The execution of God's divine wrath, especially if the sin has been hindering the work of the church, is a just act of God that warrants praise from the saints, which is what we see in verse 20. And then we get to verses 21 through 24, and this is actually reminiscent of Jeremiah, who performed a symbolic act back in chapter 51, verse 61. And it says this in Jeremiah. It says, "When you finish reading this scroll, tie a stone to it and throw it into the Euphrates. Then say, so will Babylon sink to rise no more because of the disaster I will bring on her, and the people will fall." So Jeremiah here threw a stone into the Euphrates as a symbol of the fall of Babylon in the Old Testament. And so now, in a similar fashion, in verse 21, the angel who's been showing all these things to John, what's he do? He portrays the fall of Rome here by throwing a large millstone into the sea. And he declares several things here. First off, in verse 21, he says there's going to be no more Babylon, which means there's going to be no more Rome anymore. He says in verse 22, there's no more music, which basically means there's no more joy. He says in verse 22 also, there's no more trade, which means there's going to be no more business there. And then in verse 23, he says no more light. And then finally in verse 23, he says there's no more marriage, which basically just means there's no more love in Babylon. And then finally, in order to give the readers an explanation as to why this severe sentence is being imposed on the angel, why this severe sentence is being imposed on Babylon, the angel discloses the secrets of what Babylon has been doing. This is what Rome did. Rome deceived the nations, and Rome killed saints, and also many other people on the earth, not just the saints. Her splendor, the splendor of Rome, was purchased through deception, through sorcery, and through blood, and now they were going to reap the fruits of her sins against the church and also against the world as well. All right, that's chapter 19. Questions? So chapter 20 the first 10 verses is just an extension of what we've talked about here. You think I should stop? Okay, I'll stop. So I was going to go the first, but we'll wait. We'll postpone it. That'd be a good stop here. So I was going to maybe cover the first 10 verses of chapter 20 because it's basically just carries right on into what we've just read here. So anybody have any questions about what we talked about tonight? Well, I believe it was Domitian. So the McGuigan that wrote that book, so when he goes through that, sort of list of people, he believes that Vespasian was the ruler when John wrote the book, and then I think what was it, Tertullius or who? Let me go back to that list. Yeah, here it is. So he thinks Vespasian was the ruler who sent John to Patmos. He thinks Titus, who only ruled for like 2 years, was the emperor during the part of the time that John was on the island. But by the time the book was distributed and John was off the island of Patmos, that Domitian was the emperor. So a lot of people don't disagree with that because there's this history that talks about how Revelation was written during the time of Domitian, but he says that because John was still alive and Domitian was emperor, that's what the person in history was talking about. So anyway, I don't know that. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, that's a good question though, but I'm not sure.